Live pictures of people on the streets of Tel Aviv, the protesters that have been there for many, many nights recently, now in a form of celebration, or at least ringing in the fact that this deal seems to have been done. Meanwhile, the cameras show the scene in Khan Yunis in Gaza, where again more people are out on the streets celebrating the news that this ceasefire deal seems to have been concluded. We're still waiting for the Qatari Prime Minister to confirm exactly what the contours of that deal look like, and indeed that it has been done. You'll hear that live on LBC as and when it happens. Ash is in Notting Hill. Hi, Ash.
Hi. You have to see what's going to happen to the hostages. Basically, this was a big risk for Prime Minister Netanyahu to take that, despite disagreement within his party and then cabinet and everyone else's. But he had to do that for the sake of Trump and welcoming him to White House. If you look at the other side after the ceasefire, and then this process is going, we don't know where the hostages are. We don't know how many are dead, how many are alive, and we don't know if it's going to happen, because there is an agreement and disagreement within the Hamas and a Palestinian who says you shouldn't deal with him and that they might get killed before they come out. So this is very risky, and even Hamas doesn't know where some of them are, because it's been separated all among the Palestine and Gaza.
Do you think, from what we know so far of the deal itself, that this is one that's actually going to last? I mean, it doesn't fill me with great confidence that 16 days into the phase one part of this agreement, they're going to start to negotiate phase two. That feels to me like that's the point at which it could break down again.
That's very true, that is, because what's happening from the beginning, they hide these hostages and then they separate them, and then in their small groups. And then they don't have a communication because of the cyber security and all those things from Israel. So they can't find out where the hostages are. So they don't know where they are actually. This is the trouble.
Yeah,
they don't know exactly where they are. They don't have a communication among them. But Palestinian itself and then the other organizations are pressuring Hamas to get the ceasefire done. Otherwise, there will be a death toll in Wintender.
Ash, really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. The scene in Tel Aviv tonight, where there are hundreds of people on the streets with the photographs, placards bearing the faces of some of the hostages that were taken. Meanwhile, in Khan Yunis, there are fires that are burning in the gloom, the almost complete darkness, actually, presumably amongst the rubble in various places in Gaza. Let's speak to Sir Michael Fallon, former Conservative Defence Secretary. Thank you for coming on the programme, Sir Michael. There's a couple of other negotiations I'd like to talk to you about, but we have to start here this evening. Do you think then that under their own terms for entering into this conflict militarily, to bring the hostages home and to defeat Hamas, it's been a failure?
No, I don't think it has been a failure. Obviously, it's taken far longer to get the hostages home. But if they are properly home, we haven't seen the details of the deal. If they are properly home, Hamas is then in a much weaker position. Now, it's perfectly true that some of these deals have a habit of coming unstuck after a few months or years, a little later on down the road. But what's impressive about this deal is it's clearly been driven by the arrival of President Trump. And he's not even in the White House, but he's made it very clear that he wanted this particular deal to happen. He's enforced it. It has happened now. And I think this is a very good example of the President Trump and the way we're going to have to deal with President Trump over the next 4 years. We're potentially dealing now with a very strong president who is determined to get his way.
Well, we're dealing with a president who deals in constructive ambiguity, because he threatens something that might happen. If the hostages aren't released by January 20th, then all hell will be let loose, or whatever the exact phrase that he used. One day, someone's going to call him out on that, isn't it? And say, right, well, what is the thing that you are going to do?
Well, it's far better that he gets these deals done, and he has got them done, by being strong, not retreating, not being isolationist, and not vacillating, as Biden has done over the years in the Middle East, weakening American leadership. We're seeing actually the opposite of what people rather feared. People feared America might withdraw. We're actually seeing Trump, actually, as a strong president, showing leadership, putting his foot down, saying, I want this deal, I want it done by the time I'm president, and getting it done.
let's see whether or not the deal holds or indeed is completely formally signed tonight. There are a couple of phases to it, as I mentioned already.
Indeed.
16 days of phase one before they then start to negotiate phase two. And do you suspect, Michael, that by the time that phase three is concluded of this deal, that Hamas will no longer be the political force, perhaps even the military force in Gaza that they are?
Well, that's what we've seen over in Lebanon with the defeat of Hezbollah. So, there's a real sense of optimism now, I think, in the medium term for the Middle East, that Iranian proxies in both Lebanon and in Gaza are being defeated. And there's the opportunity now for President Trump actually to grip the Middle East as a whole and perhaps deal with Iran for once and for all.
I mentioned there are other negotiations taking place, Trump involved in them too. Just let me ask you finally about the Chagos Islands deal. The UK is apparently mid-negotiation now on a revised deal to hand back the Chagos Islands, including the possibility, it's being reported, that the Diego Garcia base might be secured only for 50 years rather than 99. Your thoughts?
Well, this sounds a mess. I don't know why the Labour government have been trying to rush this deal. They tried to get it through before the election in Mauritius, and then had to re-examine it all over again when there was a new government in Mauritius. Now they've been trying to get it through before the new government in America, before President Trump arrives on Monday. Really, there isn't a rush to do this. Far better to look at it, in the cold light of day. And I'm not quite so sure why everybody regards this as a good deal. We're giving the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius and then paying them for the privilege of giving it away. It includes a very important base, not just for the Americans, by the way, Tom, but for us, for our own security or our own defence. And we need to be very careful before we start giving things away. It casts a question mark potentially over our bases in Gibraltar, on Cyprus and elsewhere. So it was always going to be a bad deal. And there have now, finally, thankfully, been some second thoughts. And yet again, it is President Trump who hovers over this deal. He will have to decide whether it's in the long-term interests of the United States, whether it's in the long-term interests of us all, in potentially, of course, allowing China to develop its own imperialism elsewhere in that ocean.
Good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on. Sir Michael Fallon, former Conservative Defence Secretary. 5:43. Let's speak to Mitchell B. Reiss, who's a diplomat working for 5 US administrations, including at the White House and the State Department, former National Security Advisor to Mitt Romney. Thank you for coming on, Mitchell. Your thoughts on what we're hearing about the contours of this ceasefire agreement?
Well, it's encouraging, but as the previous guest said, it's far from done. I think what's interesting is the timing. And again, President-elect Trump has already tweeted trying to claim credit for it, and I think he deserves a bit of credit for it. It's interesting with the timing that they've been at this for months and months and months, but right before his inaugural, after his threat, it happens.
And what would you say was I get the point about constructive ambiguity and Trump saying, if you don't do this by this date, then all hell will break loose. But in the room itself, what would be the hell that could have been unleashed, do you think?
Well, it's unclear. And from Trump's perspective, it was a perfect opportunity because he could be unclear and bellicose, threatening. But if it didn't work, he would be able to blame the Biden administration, not himself. So there were very little consequences or downside for this type of rhetoric. It gets a little trickier, as you suggested, once he becomes president, and he'll be accountable for his statements.
Do you think that the Biden administration could or should or were as tough on the Netanyahu government as they perhaps might have been?
That's a very complicated question. I think by and large, they've been supportive generally on the military side. They were very upset over the humanitarian issues. And I think that probably it's one of those where mistakes were made on both sides. But I think by and large, the Biden team has tried to be a staunch ally. Perhaps they could have been a little bit more robust in publicly defending Israel. But I don't think they're going to have to worry about it with President Trump in office. Good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. Mitchell B. Reiss, diplomat who's worked for 5 US administrations, including at the White House and the State Department.